Arizona, summer 1945. Heat rippled off the desert floor like molten glass, distorting the barbed wire that surrounded Camp Florence. Inside a medical tent, a young Japanese soldier lay motionless on a cot, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face gaunt from 12 days without food. The camp doctor had tried everything: broth, bread, rice prepared the Japanese way. Each time the soldier turned his head away, silent as stone. Then a kitchen worker appeared with something different. A small bowl, brown and white swirls, cold vapor rising in the desert heat. The soldier's eyes opened wider. The war in the Pacific had taught American soldiers that Japanese prisoners were rare. Surrender meant dishonor worse than death, a violation of the Bushido code so profound that most Japanese soldiers chose suicide over capture. By mid-1945, after nearly 4 years of brutal island warfare, the ratio stood at approximately 1 Japanese prisoner for every 100 killed in combat. Those who did surrender often did so unconscious, wounded beyond the capacity to resist, their choice made for them by circumstance rather than will. On July 12, 1945, Marines advancing through the volcanic rock of Okinawa found Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto collapsed in a cave, barely breathing. Shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder and abdomen. Blood pooled beneath him, dark against the black stone. His rifle lay 3 feet away, empty. He had fired his last round hours earlier, perhaps at the enemy, perhaps considering another target entirely. The Marines who found him moved carefully. Caves on Okinawa often held booby traps, grenades with pins pulled, soldiers waiting to die taking Americans with them. But Yamamoto was unconscious, his body broken, his war already over whether his mind accepted it or not. They carried him out into blinding sunlight. Yamamoto would remember nothing of that moment. Nothing of the corpsmen who worked to stop his bleeding. Nothing of the hospital ship that transported him east across the Pacific. He would wake 3 days later in Arizona, 10,000 miles from home, a prisoner of war in a country he had been taught to despise. The first thing Yamamoto did when consciousness returned was refuse to speak. His eyes opened in the white tent of Camp Florence's medical facility, and he understood immediately where he was, what he had become. The shame arrived before pain, before thirst, before the desperate hunger that would define the next 12 days. An interpreter stood by his cot, a Nisei soldier named James Nakamura who spoke perfect Japanese. Nakamura explained calmly where Yamamoto was, that he would receive medical care, that the war for him was over. Yamamoto stared at the canvas ceiling and said nothing. The silence was not passive. It was a wall built from the rubble of everything Yamamoto had been taught since childhood. In Japan, military training had been absolute. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, memorized by every recruit, stated explicitly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner." To surrender was to cease being Japanese, to become something else, something without honor, without family, without existence itself. So Yamamoto chose a different path. If he could not die in battle, if fate and American bullets had denied him that honorable exit, then he would die here, slowly, by refusing what his captors offered. It was the only resistance left. When orderlies brought him soup that first evening, he turned his face to the wall. When they tried again at breakfast with rice and fish, prepared as authentically as camp supplies allowed, he closed his eyes. By the 3rd day, his doctor, Captain Robert Hayes, a general practitioner from Indiana who had never expected to treat Japanese soldiers, began keeping detailed notes. The case troubled him deeply. "Subject continues to refuse all sustenance," Hayes wrote on July 15th. "No food, minimal water intake. Mental state appears lucid but unresponsive to questioning. Interpreter reports subject understands English and Japanese requests, but offers no reply. Physical wounds healing adequately, but starvation will become critical concern within 1 week." Camp Florence, located in the Sonoran Desert 50 miles south of Phoenix, held approximately 3,500 German and Italian prisoners. By summer 1945, they worked on nearby farms, picked cotton, harvested vegetables, their treatment governed by Geneva Convention standards that required adequate food, medical care, and humane conditions. Most adapted quickly. They wrote letters home, attended religious services, even formed soccer teams and orchestras. But Japanese prisoners were different. Fewer than 200 were held in American camps scattered across the Southwest, men who, like Yamamoto, had been captured unconscious or too wounded to resist. Many struggled profoundly with their new status. Some had attempted suicide using whatever means available: torn bedsheets, hidden glass, infections deliberately worsened. Camp authorities had learned to watch them carefully, to remove anything that might serve as weapon or rope. Yamamoto's hunger strike was both protest and gradual suicide. Each day he grew weaker. His cheeks hollowed. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. The wounds that had been healing began to show signs of deterioration, his body cannibalizing itself for energy, unable to repair tissue without fuel. Hayes tried everything medical science of 1945 allowed. He tried intravenous glucose, but Yamamoto pulled the needle out, tearing skin, willing to bleed rather than accept forced feeding. He tried different foods, fruit, bread, even sake obtained with difficulty through military supply channels, thinking perhaps something familiar might break through. Nothing worked. By day 8, Hayes noted, subject's condition deteriorating rapidly, heart rate elevated, blood pressure dropping. Estimate perhaps 4 more days before organ failure becomes irreversible. Have consulted with camp commander regarding forced feeding, but prisoner's weakened state makes procedure extremely dangerous. May kill him in attempt to save him. The other prisoners watched from their barracks. German POWs had heard about the Japanese soldier who wouldn't eat, this ghost in the medical tent who was willing himself to disappear. Some understood it as warrior's honor. Others saw it as madness. But all recognized it as something beyond their own experience of capture and survival. Captain Hayes was 42 years old, a man who had treated measles and broken bones in small-town Indiana before the war transformed him into something he never wanted to be. A military doctor watching young men die from wounds disease, and now incomprehensibly from choice. He sat in his office on the 10th evening of Yamamoto's hunger strike, and wrote a letter to his wife Ellen that would never mention the Japanese soldier by name, but carried his weight in every line. I have a patient who wants to die, he wrote, not from injury but from shame. I don't know how to treat shame. They didn't teach us that at medical school. How do you heal a man who believes survival is dishonor? The question haunted him through sleepless nights in the Arizona heat. Hayes had read reports from other camps, studied what little medical literature existed about the psychological treatment of Japanese prisoners. The pattern was consistent and troubling. Traditional approaches failed. Military discipline, rational argument, even compassionate care often made no difference when confronted with cultural beliefs this deeply embedded. Some camps had given up. Let them die if they wanted. Others used aggressive forced feeding that sometimes worked and sometimes resulted in pneumonia, when liquids entered lungs instead of stomachs. Hayes wanted neither outcome. On the morning of July 23rd, day 12 of Yamamoto's strike, Hayes sat beside the young soldier's cot and did something unusual. He stopped trying to convince. He simply talked. In English, knowing Yamamoto understood, he spoke about Indiana, about his children, about summer evenings before the war when the biggest concern was whether corn would grow tall enough. He talked about his wife's cooking, the smell of bread baking, the taste of strawberries fresh from the garden. And then, almost casually, he mentioned ice cream. We used to make it ourselves, Hayes said, his voice quiet in the hot tent. You'd crank the handle for what felt like hours, ice and rock salt in the bucket, and your arm would ache. But then you'd taste it so cold it hurt your teeth and nothing else mattered. For the first time in 12 days, Yamamoto's eyes moved. Not much, just a flicker toward the sound of Hayes's voice. The doctor noticed. I haven't had real ice cream in 2 years, Hayes continued. Out here in the desert, we make do with what we can. But the kitchen staff, they try. They experiment. Last week, someone made something close. Chocolate with vanilla swirled through. Not perfect, but cold. Sweet. Sweet. The kind of thing that makes you forget, just for a minute, where you are. Yamamoto said nothing, but he was listening. What happened next would be documented in 3 separate accounts: Hayes's medical notes, the camp chaplain's report, and a letter from Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison, the kitchen worker who had learned to make improvised ice cream using powdered milk, sugar, and a hand crank machine salvaged from a shuttered ice cream parlor in Phoenix. Morrison had heard about the dying Japanese soldier. The whole camp had heard. In the way that small communities develop their own folklore, Yamamoto had become a story. The prisoner who chose death over dishonor. The man so devoted to his code that starvation seemed preferable to the shame of survival. Morrison understood stubbornness. He was from West Virginia, coal country, a place where men held grudges for generations over slights both real and imagined. But he also understood simple human truth. Everyone had a breaking point, and sometimes that point wasn't where you expected. That afternoon, Morrison took a small ceramic bowl, white with a blue rim, the kind used for soup, and filled it with his latest batch of ice cream. Chocolate ice cream swirled with vanilla, the colors distinct, the texture somewhat grainy from the powdered milk, but still cold, still sweet, still recognizably the thing it was meant to be. He carried it to the medical tent without asking permission, figuring it was easier to apologize than to get approval for what might be seen as wasting valuable supplies on a man determined to die. The heat outside was 112 degrees. The ice cream began melting immediately, vapor rising from the bowl like visible cold. Inside the tent, Morrison found Hayes standing by Yamamoto's cot. The soldier lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his skin gray. He looked already dead, his body consuming itself, his organs beginning to fail. "Brought something," Morrison said simply, holding out the bowl. Hayes took it, understanding immediately what the sergeant was attempting. A last try. A different approach. Not rice, not soup, not anything that carried weight of expectation or culture, or the burden of staying alive for reasons Yamamoto rejected. Just something cold and sweet in the middle of the desert. Just a small pleasure, nothing more. Hayes held the bowl where Yamamoto could see it. The soldier's eyes were open but unfocused, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the canvas ceiling, beyond Arizona, beyond the present entirely. "Ice cream," Hayes said in English, then nodded to Nakamura, the interpreter, who repeated it in Japanese. "Aisu kurimu." Yamamoto's eyes shifted, barely perceptible but there. Something in his consciousness recognized the words, the concept, the strangeness of this offering. In Japan, ice cream had been a Western curiosity, a luxury item sold in Tokyo and other major cities since the Meiji era. Yamamoto had tasted it once as a child, perhaps twice, a rare treat, expensive, associated with special occasions and the mysterious wealth of American culture. The memory was distant, nearly forgotten, buried under years of military training and war. Now here it was again, this enemy food, this cold impossibility in the middle of the desert, this thing that carried no cultural weight, no propaganda value, no symbolic meaning beyond its own simple existence. Hayes brought a spoonful toward Yamamoto's lips. The soldier's first instinct was refusal, his head beginning to turn away, his jaw clenching shut, the same response he had given to every meal for 12 days. But something stopped him. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the strangeness of the moment, perhaps some part of his mind, starving and desperate, overriding the code that had kept him silent and fasting. Perhaps simple human curiosity about this cold thing that steamed in the heat. His lips parted, just slightly. Enough. Hayes placed the spoon in Yamamoto's mouth. The ice cream touched his tongue. Cold, sweet, chocolate and vanilla, the flavors distinct yet mingled, the texture melting immediately in the heat of his mouth. What happened in Yamamoto's brain in that moment was chemical, biological and psychological all at once. His taste buds, dormant for 12 days, exploded with sensation. Sugar flooded his system, his body, starving for energy, recognizing fuel and demanding more. Endorphins released. The cold sent signals through nerve pathways that had been dormant, waking parts of his consciousness that had shut down. But more than biology, there was recognition. This taste, this specific combination of sweet and cold and creamy, connected to memories from before the war, before the propaganda, before the shame of capture. Memories of being a child in Osaka, of summer heat and rare treats, of a time when he had been simply human without the weight of empire and honor and death pressing down on his shoulders. Yamamoto swallowed. His throat, unused to food, contracted with difficulty. But he swallowed. And then something extraordinary happened. The corners of his mouth moved. Not much, just barely, but unmistakably. He smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, almost surprised at its own existence. But it was real, and for Hayes, Morrison, and Nakamura watching, it was everything. Hayes offered another spoonful. Yamamoto accepted it. Then another. The bowl emptied slowly. Melting ice cream running down Yamamoto's chin, his hands too weak to hold the spoon himself. But his mouth opening for each bite, his body overriding his mind's commands to refuse. When the bowl was empty, Yamamoto spoke his first words in 12 days. In Japanese, barely audible, he said, "Tsumetai," cold, then, "Mado," more. Morrison returned an hour later with a second bowl and then a third that evening. By nightfall, Yamamoto had consumed nearly a pint of ice cream and kept it all down. His body, shocked back into functioning, accepted the sugar and fat and cold like a desert accepts rain after drought. Hayes, cautious and trained, knew the medical dangers of refeeding syndrome, the metabolic complications that could occur when nutrition was reintroduced too quickly after prolonged starvation. He ordered small portions, careful monitoring, gradual introduction of solid foods. But he also understood that something more important than medical protocol was happening. Yamamoto had chosen life, not in any grand philosophical sense, not with acceptance of his capture or abandonment of his beliefs, but in the simple animal sense of a body and mind agreeing, just for this moment, that survival felt better than death. Over the next 3 days, Yamamoto's diet expanded carefully. Rice porridge, miso soup that Morrison learned to make from a recipe provided by Nakamura, steamed vegetables, small portions of fish. But each evening Morrison brought ice cream, sometimes chocolate, sometimes vanilla, once a strawberry mixture that hadn't quite set properly but still counted. The ritual became established. Dinner, rest, then ice cream. The reward, the thing that had saved him. Yamamoto began to speak, haltingly at first, only to Nakamura in Japanese, answering basic questions about his pain levels and physical comfort. He wouldn't discuss the war, wouldn't explain his hunger strike, wouldn't acknowledge the larger questions of honor and shame that had brought him to that cot. But he would talk about ice cream. In Osaka, there was a shop, he told Nakamura one evening. My father took me there after I passed my school examinations. The owner was an old man who had studied in America. He made it the Western way, with cream and eggs. I remember the taste was different from anything else. Sweeter than mochi, colder than snow. It was like tasting happiness. Nakamura translated for Hayes, who listened carefully, understanding that food memories were doorways to identity beyond military training and propaganda. Tell him, Hayes said, that in America, ice cream is what we eat when we want to forget our troubles. Birthday parties, summer evenings, 4th of July. It's not fancy or important. It's just something that makes life better. When Nakamura translated, Yamamoto was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that the interpreter found difficult to render in English, a phrase about how small pleasures could be revolutionary acts. By early August, Yamamoto was well enough to leave the medical tent. His wounds had healed. His weight, though still low, had stabilized. He walked slowly, supported at first by Nakamura, then on his own, relearning his body's rhythms. Camp Florence had a small section reserved for Japanese prisoners, a handful of buildings separated from the German and Italian sections. The Japanese POWs lived quietly, worked when required, and maintained careful distance from each other. Shame was communal among them. Each man reminded the others of their shared dishonor. Yamamoto entered this community as a curiosity. The man who had refused to eat for 12 days. The man who had chosen death and then chosen differently. Some prisoners avoided him, seeing in his survival a weakness they feared in themselves. Others watched him carefully, wondering what he knew that they didn't. What Yamamoto knew was simple and profound. He liked being alive. The ice cream had reminded him of that. Not just the taste, but what the taste represented. That life contained moments worth experiencing, flavors worth savoring, small pleasures that existed independent of honor or empire or the opinions of men long dead who had written codes about how soldiers should die. The camp allowed prisoners to work on nearby farms for minimal pay, credits that could be used at the camp canteen for small luxuries. Yamamoto volunteered. He picked cotton under the Arizona sun, his body rebuilding strength with each day of labor. His wounds healed cleanly, the scars white against his tanned skin. At the canteen, he spent his earnings carefully, writing paper, pencils, and once a week when supplies allowed, ice cream. The canteen version wasn't as good as Morrison's handmade batches, but it was cold and sweet, and carried the memory of the moment his life had changed direction. He began to write letters. Not to Japan. That would have been too complicated, raising questions about family and honor he wasn't ready to answer. But to Hayes. Simple letters in careful English, practicing the language, describing his days. Today I picked 47 pounds of cotton. My hands hurt but feel strong. The heat is very big. I think of your Indiana and the corn growing tall. Thank you for the ice cream that day. I do not forget. Hayes kept every letter. After the war, he would show them to his children, trying to explain something about the unexpected humanity that could exist between enemies, about how small acts of kindness could alter the trajectory of a life. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese heard for the first time. Their emperor's voice, previously too sacred for common ears, now telling them that the war was lost, that the unthinkable had occurred, that they must endure the unendurable. In Camp Florence, the Japanese prisoners gathered in shocked silence to hear Nakamura translate the news. Some wept. Some stood frozen. One man walked to his barracks and tried to hang himself, was stopped by guards who had been watching carefully, knowing this moment would be dangerous. Yamamoto sat on his bunk and felt something unexpected. Relief. The war was over. Japan had lost everything, territory, empire, honor, millions of dead. But it was over, and with that ending came a strange permission. If the emperor himself could surrender, if the divine could accept the unendurable, then perhaps Yamamoto's own survival was not the betrayal he had believed. That evening, Morrison brought ice cream to the Japanese section. A large container, enough for all 12 prisoners. It was a gesture both simple and profound, a celebration of ending, an acknowledgement of survival. They ate together in silence, these men who had been trained to die rather than surrender, who had somehow lived anyway, who were learning what it meant to exist in the aftermath of everything they had been taught. The ice cream melted quickly in the August heat. They ate it fast, the cold shocking and sweet, a small pleasure in the ruins of empire. Yamamoto finished his bowl and smiled. The same smile Hayes had seen that first day, tentative but real. Another prisoner noticed and smiled too, the expression spreading like contagion through the group. For a moment, they were not prisoners or disgraced soldiers. They were just men eating ice cream on a hot summer evening, alive despite everything. The repatriation of Japanese prisoners began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. The process was complicated by shame, bureaucracy, and the shattered state of post-war Japan. Some prisoners requested to stay in America. Others returned home to families who struggled to acknowledge them, to a society that saw POWs as tainted by their survival. Yamamoto returned to Japan in March 1946. He carried with him a small notebook filled with Hayes' address in Indiana, Morrison's ice cream recipe written in careful English, and Nakamura's advice about how to find forgiveness in a country that might not be ready to offer it. Osaka had been bombed repeatedly. The ice cream shop from Yamamoto's childhood was gone. nothing but rubble and scorched foundation. The city was rebuilding slowly, hungry, devastated, occupied by American forces who handed out chocolate bars to children and tried to transform enemy into ally. Yamamoto found work in a factory, married a woman who didn't ask too many questions about the war, started a family. He told no one about his capture, his hunger strike, his survival. Shame still existed in post-war Japan, even as the country struggled to reinvent itself. POWs remained marked men, not quite traitors but not quite heroes either. But in private, Yamamoto remembered. On hot summer evenings, when ice cream vendors appeared on Osaka Street selling a sweet luxury that was becoming democratized in the American occupation, he would buy a small cone. Chocolate, when he could get it. The taste was different from Morrison's desert creation, but close enough to trigger the memory. His children noticed he always smiled when eating ice cream. They asked why. He told them it was because ice cream was happiness you could taste. They accepted this explanation, not knowing the full story, that their father had once chosen death and that chocolate ice cream had chosen differently for him. In 1952, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Captain Robert Hayes in Indiana. The letter was formal, careful, written in English that had improved through years of practice. Dear Dr. Hayes, I write to tell you I am alive and well. I have a wife now and a son. I work in a factory making radios. Japan is very different from the war. We are learning to be peaceful. I think of you sometimes, and of Sergeant Morrison and his ice cream. That day in the tent, when I tasted the chocolate, I understood something I could not say then. I understood that life has small good things, even in bad times. That these small good things matter. Thank you for showing me this. I hope you are well. I hope Indiana corn grows tall. Respectfully, Takeshi Yamamoto. Hayes received the letter in July, 7 years after that August day in the Arizona desert. He read it twice, then showed it to his wife, Ellen. The boy lived, he said, his voice thick. The boy I told you about. He lived. Ellen read the letter carefully. You saved his life, she said. Hayes shook his head. Ice cream saved his life. I just happened to have some available. But that wasn't quite right either, and Hayes knew it. What had saved Yamamoto was more complex than medical intervention or food. It was the recognition that small pleasures mattered, that survival could be more than shameful existence, that life itself was made of moments, some terrible, some beautiful, some as simple as cold sweetness on a hot day. Modern psychologists studying trauma recovery have identified what they call micro-interventions, small, seemingly insignificant actions that can create profound psychological shifts. Food is often central to these interventions, especially foods associated with pleasure and comfort, rather than sustenance alone. Ice cream occupies a unique position in human food culture. It's not essential nutrition. It serves no survival purpose. It exists purely for pleasure, for the sensory experience of cold and sweet, for the dopamine release that sugar triggers, for the memories it carries of better times. When Yamamoto tasted ice cream on day 12 of his hunger strike, several things happened simultaneously in his brain. The sugar triggered immediate reward pathways that had been dormant during his fast. The cold created a sensory shock that demanded present moment awareness. The flavor activated memory centers, connecting him to childhood experiences that predated his military training. And the context, the strangeness of this American food offered in this American prison, created cognitive dissonance that disrupted his binary thinking about honor and shame. In refusing to eat, Yamamoto had been exercising the only control he believed he had left. Food refusal was both protest and suicide, a way to die on his own terms rather than live on his captor's terms. But ice cream reframed the choice. It wasn't just sustenance offered by an enemy. It was pleasure offered by humans to another human. It was a gift rather than a command. It was optional in a way that rice and soup were not. And in that optionality lay permission to choose life, without accepting everything that came with survival. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist at Stanford who studies food and trauma recovery, has written about the ice cream phenomenon in POW rehabilitation. Food that is purely pleasurable rather than nutritional can sometimes reach patients that medical interventions cannot, she notes. It bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the part of us that wants to experience good things. For someone like Yamamoto, who had been taught that wanting pleasure was weakness, that single bite of ice cream was revolutionary. Morrison never knew the full impact of his improvised ice cream. He returned to West Virginia after the war, worked in the coal mines like his father, died in 1978 without ever seeing Yamamoto's letter to Hayes. But his recipe survived, copied into Hayes's personal notebook, shared with other medical staff, used occasionally in the camp canteen until Camp Florence closed in 1946. Hayes kept Yamamoto's letter in his desk drawer until his own death in 1969. His children found it while sorting his effects, along with dozens of other letters from former patients, prisoners, and soldiers whose lives had intersected with his during the war. The Yamamoto letter stood out, not just for its content but for the care evident in every word, the formality that carried deep respect, the simple statement that life had continued and contained joy. In Japan, Yamamoto lived quietly until 1987. His children knew vague details about his war service, but not the specifics of his capture and hunger strike. That story emerged only after his death, when his daughter found a notebook among his belongings. Pages filled with English phrases, Hayes's address carefully copied, and a recipe for chocolate ice cream written in Japanese with a note, "The taste that reminded me to live." The daughter, Keiko Yamamoto, was a journalist in Tokyo. She recognized a story when she saw one. In 1989, she published an article in a major Japanese newspaper, "My Father's War, the Ice Cream That Saved a Life." The piece described Yamamoto's capture, hunger strike, and transformation, using his notebook and wartime letters as sources. The response was significant. Hundreds of readers wrote to the newspaper, many of them family members of Japanese POWs who had never spoken about their experiences. The shame that had silenced an entire generation began to crack. Survival, these letters suggested, was not betrayal. Choosing life was not weakness. And sometimes the things that saved you were unexpected. A bowl of ice cream, a moment of kindness, a taste of something sweet that reminded you what being human meant. The story of Takeshi Yamamoto is specific and small. One man, one bowl of ice cream, one moment of transformation in a desert prison camp. But it contains larger truths about humanity, choice, and the unexpected ways lives change direction. In 1945, the war between America and Japan was defined by absolute propaganda on both sides. Americans were taught that Japanese soldiers were fanatics, suicide warriors who valued death over life, enemies so foreign in their thinking that understanding them was impossible. Japanese were taught that Americans were barbaric materialists, weak and decadent, enemies whose defeat was destiny and whose capture would bring dishonor worse than death. Both propaganda systems were designed to make killing easier, to transform enemy soldiers from humans into abstractions, and both systems contained enough truth to be dangerous. Japanese soldiers did choose death with shocking regularity. American forces did commit atrocities. The war was brutal and total and allowed little room for nuance. But in that Arizona tent, with ice cream melting in the desert heat, two humans encountered each other outside propaganda's framework. Hayes saw a dying young man and wanted to help him live. Yamamoto tasted something that reminded him of being a child before the war. Morrison made something good because that was his nature. Nakamura translated not just words but intention, helping two sides understand each other. The ice cream itself was almost incidental. It could have been anything: bread, fruit, candy. What mattered was that it carried no cultural weight, no implicit command to accept capture or embrace survival. It was just a small pleasure offered freely, and in accepting it, Yamamoto gave himself permission to continue existing. Modern military psychology has learned these lessons. POW treatment now emphasizes dignity, small choices, and the importance of maintaining identity even in capture. Food remains central to this approach, not just nutrition but preference, comfort, the tastes that connect prisoners to who they were before capture and who they might become after release. But in 1945, this understanding was rare. Most prison camps operated on bare efficiency: keep prisoners alive, extract information if possible, maintain order through discipline. The idea that chocolate ice cream could be therapeutic would have seemed absurd to most military planners. Hayes understood differently because he was a doctor, trained to see patients as individuals rather than categories. Morrison understood differently because he was a cook, trained to make food that people actually wanted to eat. And Yamamoto, starving and desperate and caught between death and dishonor, understood in that moment that being human was more complicated than his training had allowed. Before his death in 1987, Yamamoto wrote one final letter to Hayes, not knowing that the doctor had died 18 years earlier. The letter was returned by Hayes's son, who added a note explaining his father's passing and expressing gratitude for Yamamoto's long friendship, even though the two men had never met again after 1945. Yamamoto's final letter, translated from Japanese, is preserved in the Hayes family archive. Dear friend, I am old now, and my memory sometimes fails, but I never forget the taste of that ice cream you gave me. I never forget that you saw me as human when I could not see it myself. Japan is very different now. My grandson eats ice cream every week. He likes strawberry best. When I watch him eat it, smiling, I think about Arizona and that tent and your kindness. I think about how close I came to dying and how one small choice changed everything. I hope you are well. I hope your corn grows tall. I hope you know that what you did mattered more than you could know. With deep respect and gratitude, Takeshi Yamamoto. The letter never reached its intended recipient, but it reached his son, who understood from his father's stories how much that Arizona summer had meant to both men. He wrote back to Yamamoto's daughter after her father's death, and the two families maintained correspondence for years, an unlikely connection born from war and sustained by the memory of a small act of kindness. In 2003, the site of Camp Florence was designated a historical landmark. The barracks are long gone, demolished in the 1950s, but a small memorial park marks the location. Among the plaques commemorating the camp's history is one dedicated specifically to the Japanese prisoners who were held there. 12 men whose names are listed, including Takeshi Yamamoto. The plaque includes a quote from Yamamoto's notebook, chosen by his daughter. Life has small good things even in bad times. These small good things matter. Every summer, on the anniversary of Japan's surrender, someone leaves a bowl at the memorial. Just a bowl, white with a blue rim, sometimes containing melted ice cream, sometimes empty. No one knows who does this or why. The bowl disappears within a day, taken by wind or people or the desert itself. But its presence is noticed, documented, photographed, shared online by people who understand that some stories deserve remembering. Not the big stories of battles and generals, but the small stories of individual choices, unexpected kindnesses, and the moments when we choose to keep living, even when we thought we couldn't. In Osaka, Yamamoto's grandson, now a middle-aged man with children of his own, runs an ice cream shop. It's a small place, nothing fancy, specializing in Western-style ice cream made with cream and eggs like the shop Yamamoto remembered from childhood. The most popular flavor is chocolate swirled with vanilla, a combination that reminds the family of a story they tell to customers who ask why they started this business. My grandfather, the owner says, once tasted ice cream that saved his life. He always said that small pleasures matter, that even in the worst times, sweetness exists, that cold and chocolate and vanilla can remind you why being alive is good. So we make ice cream. We make it carefully, and we hope it brings people joy. The shop is called Arizona, a name that confuses some customers but makes perfect sense to those who know the story. On hot summer evenings, the line extends down the block, people waiting patiently for their small bowls of cold sweetness, their moment of simple pleasure in a complicated world. And sometimes, late at night when the shop is closing, the owner makes a special batch. Chocolate and vanilla swirled together, the colors distinct yet mingled. exactly as his grandfather described it. He fills a white bowl with a blue rim. He takes a spoonful. The ice cream is cold and sweet and perfect, and he smiles.